Welcome back. As the planned finale to this series, I have for you priests some very spell-specific tips. So let's get right into it. First on the list is Power Word Shield. This tip isn't really fun or novel, but rather one that I see go unused too often. If you're going to pre-shield, do it way before combat starts, like 20 seconds before, because the shields last 30. And weaving some mage water between each, you can probably cast upwards of 4 before combat begins, and yet still be at full mana. Two other good uses are to apply Power Word Shield to the ranged player who, according to your raid frames, just pulled aggro, and pop one on the rogues if you find yourself with a spare GCD within 25 seconds or so of some expected splash damage. Shadow Fiend. Do it early and do it often. In fact, some boss fights are long enough that you can actually squeeze in 2. Also, if you hear a countdown for drums or heroism or bloodlust, release your Fiend. Those suckers return much more mana when hasted. And lastly, it's better to use them on trash and miss them for bosses than to save the Fiend all night and never use it at all. Fade. Try using it at the end of a prayer of healing. It's not a bad habit to develop because big heals like that are what is going to cause you to pull aggro. Also, consider using it as soon as the multi-mob pull begins, just in case it goes awry or a tank gets feared early. If you pull aggro, do use Fade instead of Shield. Fear Ward. It's not just for tanks. There are kicking and interrupt classes, maybe even yourself, that might really be a better choice. So, talk it over with your raid leader, because remember, Fear Ward's cooldown is as long as it buffs you, so the planning is critical. Inner Fire. Refresh your Inner Fire whenever you're out of combat. Don't worry about it in combat. Use a buff mod if you have to, so that your mouse wheel casts it whenever there's just a few seconds before expiration. There's really no reason to miss out on this free armor. Shadow Word Death. You can actually use Shadow Word Death to ping the Prayer of Mending that landed on you off. That is cheaper than spending it on a new Prayer of Mending, but just make sure it's only something you're doing if there's about 3 charges left on that Prayer Mending. So let's talk about Inner Focus. To get better at using it, start by using it on cooldown. And no, not with a macro. Then, dial it back a bit so that you're using it for those important cases. For example, do you need a crit? Use it. You'll probably get a crit. Do you need a prayer of healing during a boss fight? Use it. Free prayer healings are great. Do you need to respect the 5-second rule just a bit longer? Use it. Remember, any free cast counts toward your idle time. What about, group buffing Group 3 in combat? No, no, don't use Inner Focus for that. That's like a mage who evocates out of combat. Speaking of mages, though, the next spell is Water. It's what you should spam while waiting to get out of combat. Think of it this way. If the goal is to spend all of your mana every pull, and you successfully did so on the last pull, what was the whole point if now you're basically for the upcoming pull? Yeah, so budget 25 mage water per hour, and don't be bashful about asking for a refill. Next up, Monopods. The right way to handle intense fights is to chug one when you're missing slightly more than the potion's top end. Each version is a little different. Let's pretend the version you're drinking can restore up to 2500 mana. If so, I wouldn't drink one until I was missing about maybe 2800. After that, chug on cooldown, still assuming you need a little more than the potion might ever provide. What you don't want to do is chug one for more than you actually need. That's just a waste. First aid. It's mana free. It's got a crazy long leash. It doesn't necessarily break when taking damage, and it keeps you contributing in a meaningful way while still activating the 5-second rule. So keep 40 in your bags at all times and use them. I get a lot of questions about flash heal, and here's my approach. If a player is still taking damage after the burst, you can use it as long as the damage is going to be less or the same strength as your flash heal. Because if they're going to get walloped by something bigger, they're going to die anyway, whether your flash heal lands. So there's probably a greater heal that's appropriately sized. Now, if the player has all done taking damage, there's no need to rush with the flash heal. Put a renew and move on. So when do you flash heal? Maybe not often. You could, of course, use it to snipe, but that's fine. But probably the most important thing is to use it for topping off when there's an impending death mechanic coming. Otherwise, I find that shields and renews and graders seem to just work better, at least for me. Okay, next time your Fade resists, try Binding Heal. Not only will it hit as hard as Flash in the same amount of time, but you can stay on your healing assignment and do so with less threat. Hell, I use Binding even if I'm at full health. It's like trading mana for threat reduction. Greater Heal. Get good at using it. The better you are at Greater, the less you will use Flash. Worth noting, a counterintuitive time to use Greater is actually when the tank is at full health for more than a couple of swings, boss swings. Because the odds are his avoidance luck will run out around the time your Greater is going to be finished casting. Beware here, though, cast canceling is important, or else you'll be before you know it, so use precasted Graders at your discretion. Renew. In Burning Crusade, Renew for multiple priests can be applied to a single player, so don't let a Renew from someone else dissuade you from putting yours up there too. Also, try precasting it out of combat, because it does take a second or two for that first tick to hit. Oh, and don't let it fall off the tank once you are in combat. Although, given the choice, it's better to let it fall off than refreshing it early. Last but not least, prayer mending. Tip number 1 for prayer mending is do so before combat. That way, you don't get the healing threat from it, and you have a chance to drink back to full, and you have that spare global cooldown for something else, and you can start chipping away on prayer mending's own cooldown. Tip number 2 is for in-combat use. If the damage being dealt is less than the potency of Prayer of Mending, don't cast it on anyone who is already full, because a chunk of that is going to overheal once the damage has been dealt. Well, there you have it, tips for many of a priest's healing spells.